Obviously, your mileage may vary. There's a lot of ways to get to the same thing these days. Historically speaking, there were only a few ways to get these sounds back in the time that these music genres were uh, happening in the 70s and in the 80s. There were not a zillion ways to get these sounds like there are now. So
Okay.
that said, I'm going to dig in with amps first, and amps should come first. And the reason for that is amps create the largest percentage of your tone
Why is that?
because it's really a matter of if you own five different guitars of all different types, but you only own one amp, that amp colors every effect, every sound that you're getting out of all five guitars. So you may have vastly different sounding guitars, but if you're going through one amp, they're all going to sound like that amp
Right.
to a degree. So I would say I've always thought that the amp was probably at least 55% of your tone. And and there's another old axiom that still is true to this day, although the numbers kind of change, you know. But the old axiom went a $200 guitar sounds better through a $1,000 amp than a $1,000 guitar sounds through a $200 amp. And, you know, whether you're talking about a $500 guitar and a $3,000 amp, it's the same thing. Um, the amp really is the foundational basis of everything. And we're not even going to get a chance to really go into like cabs and speakers today, but just for the sake of this discussion, the amp really is the largest percentage of any guitar player's tone.
Okay. And
Um, Go ahead.
Marshall is the big one that you see on every stage in the background of the big
Hmm.
rock guys. But
Right.
but there's
Well,
more than one Marshall.
there's more than one Marshall, and there's more than one of those kinds of sounds, and we're going to get into that in the tube discussion.
Okay.
Um, but yes, Marshall has been by far the most successful and visible amplifier for these sounds. Um, and it's a company that has had success despite itself in a lot of cases. They've made a lot of boneheaded decisions along the way. The company has changed hands a few times, and that's very common. It was very common in the 70s with guitars and gear that the company, you know, Gibson would get bought, Fender would get bought. These things changed the quality of the gear, as you might imagine. A new leadership comes in, and they're caring more about making money than they are caring about quality control and things like that. So, yeah, it's a general thing, and we don't have really the bandwidth here to get into every nuance of every change. You could do a whole show on just Marshall's changes over the years, but
All right.
um, that's a level of gear nerd that I think
That's
we
next
can.
level.
Yeah, that's a next level. Yeah,
But
but anyway,
I know that like some people from Marshall started a new company called Black Star, and I know people from Fender went out to start a new guitar brand too. I forget they look like Fender
oh,
Stratocaster. Yeah,
GNL. That was
yeah,
when Leo Fender sold Fender, he started GNL, and before he died, obviously. But he ran that company for a few years before he died. And GNL makes Fender-ish kind of guitars. A lot of people think they, in some ways, had better quality than the Fenders. They never had the popularity, and they certainly never had. You can get a very nice guitar from them, but they never had like the resale value or anything like that. So
right.
yeah, so those things do happen. I mean, Gibson's gone through tons of changes over the years, tons of different ownership companies doing terrible things in general to their quality control. But let's try and stay on the amp track here for a second. And the one thing I always tell beginners, and usually they don't listen because everybody is like more interested in getting the cool guitar. But if you have a basic level guitar that's not giving you trouble, and you like the guitar you're playing with, it's better to invest in a good amp before you upgrade to an expensive guitar.
Okay.
In most situations, what you need from an amp in this style of music is one clean tone, one good crunch tone, and one lead tone. And it doesn't mean that your amp has to have 3 channels, but it means you need to be able to get those kinds of sounds out of an amp, whether you're meaning clean means backing off your volume till it cleans up. And if you're, overdriving it into a lead tone with a pedal or something like that, you can do that.
And can you
What
can you elaborate on what a clean crunch and a lead tone is for those
Yeah,
who don't know?
a clean tone is a tone that is not distorted. Um, you
What's a good
know,
example of that?
what's a good example of that? Um, Something you like a Buddy Holly tone or something like that. You know,
Or the Beach Boys or something?
yeah, tones that before you had distorted tones,
Right.
really. Um, Hendrix had a lot of really interesting clean tones on a lot of, things like Little Wing and Castles Made of Sand and stuff like that. Those were, some clean tones. Um, Most heavy rock players will just back off their volume until the amp cleans up a little bit, and then they'll roll the volume back up to get, the crunch tone. When I
So,
say crunch tone, that's your general rhythm tone. What you hear, like in an AC/DC context, the main guitar tone.
so if you
And then
roll back your volume, you turn the volume on the guitar itself back. So the
you can do that, or you can do it with a volume pedal. Yeah,
okay,
most people just do it with a volume knob, but if you're doing it a lot and you're using volume effects, it may be better to do it with a pedal. But a volume pedal is kind of like a wah pedal. You can rock it back and forth, and if you press down on it, you have full volume, and you back it off, you have less volume.
okay,
But most people do that with the volume knob on the guitar, and it's still a absolutely fine way to clean up your tone. So then you go into this crunchy, heavy rhythm tone, which is your main rhythm tone. And then if you want to take a solo after that, a lot of people will boost the tone a little bit further, possibly boost some of the mid-range. If you're stepping on a pedal like a Tube Screamer or something like that, it has a mid-range bump, and it gives you this nice overdriven tone that has enough sustain in it that all of your lead work will feel fluid, and you won't feel like your notes are dying out while you're playing them.
okay. So the tone feeds back into the guitar, and you can make it sing.
Yeah, it just gives you, it takes what your amp is doing and it gives it sort of a kick in the butt.
Right.
And it takes it a little further without you having to reach over to the amp and turning it up or turning up the gain on it. You just step on a pedal that boosts your existing signal, and you get a little bit more out of it.
Cool.
Now, we're not even going to get into it talking about like a lot of effects today. Again, we're just talking about the basics here of getting the basic sounds. Lots of guys using lots of effects. That's different. That would be a whole other episode, really. But when you're looking for an amp to do this kind of music, a lot of beginners fall into the trap of trying to find some amp or they get sold by a salesman, an amp that has a bunch of different sounds and are very versatile, and you can get this sound and that sound and the other sound out of the amp. A lot of these are modeled amps that are, not tube amps, or, they're hybrids or something like that. And I would say stay away from those things if, like I said, when the tone matters. If you're only going to practice in your bedroom, that's okay. But in this style of music, you don't need that much versatility. It's sort of overrated in most heavy rock and metal sort of scenarios.
Okay.
You don't need many mediocre sounds. You need one or two really good sounds.
Right. And
out of your amp.
And what is the difference between a transistor, a hybrid, and a tube amp? And what is a modeling amp exactly for those who don't know?
So in the old days, prior to, I'd say, I don't know when the transistor amps started, but certainly most of the amps throughout the 70s were tube amps. And nothing sounds like a tube amp. To this day, we have still not replicated tube tone with any kind of modern technology in a way. We're getting very close, but it's still, if you hear one next to the other, the tube amp has a bunch of harmonic characteristics that are really derived from the tubes themselves, and it's very hard to make that sound authentic in an amp that's just trying to simulate it. Okay, we're talking about vacuum tubes. The next part of this talk is going to get into specifics on that. But certainly by the early 80s, there were a lot of companies making non-tube amps. At the time, you got to understand, vacuum tubes throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, throughout the world, vacuum tubes were in everything. They were in TVs, they were in radios, they were all over the place. And then, you know, in the 60s, you got transistor radios, and they became portable, and people were carrying transistor radios around and all of that stuff. And vacuum tubes in America and in Europe started to become less and less common. They still had them around, but we're in the middle of the Cold War here, too, in the mid-70s. And as the companies that created vacuum tubes in the West started to go out of business because they were being put out of business by transistors, guitarists who wanted these things still in their amps started looking to Russia and China, who were still making vacuum tubes. And in the early 80s, there was a scare thinking, okay, you know, we're in the middle of this Cold War, and the Chinese and the Russians are our enemies. We may not be able to get these tubes anymore for our amplifiers. We better start figuring out how to make good sounding guitar amplifiers with transistors. Oh, wow. And the early attempts were not very promising, frankly.
I had no idea that was the history behind transistor amplifiers, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the transistor pretty much, the only thing we use tubes for in the West now is guitar amplifiers. Nothing else has tubes in them.
Or really expensive hi-fi amplifiers, right?
Yeah, right. Audiophile quality stuff may still do that. But I mean, but by and large, you have to say 99% of it's for guitar amplifiers.
Yeah.
And
because they get hot and they use a ton of energy.
Actually, aside from the fact that they're a lot more expensive than transistors, they weigh more, so it affects portability of any electronic device. You know, they cost more. So you could understand why you wouldn't want them in your flat screen TV, you know, and things like that. So, you know, back in the day, computers that we're talking to each other 3,000 miles apart here on a computer. In the old days, when my father was working at NASA, the computers had tubes.
Right.
Yeah. And, you know, they had those rooms, with all these vacuum tubes in them glowing hot, and they had to keep the rooms cool and all that stuff. It was really, you know, a major breakthrough of the transistor, but it's the one place it didn't translate is to guitar tone. It just never sounded anywhere near as good as a warm, glowing tube in music.
Right. So, and I know it's a sidebar, but your dad worked at NASA. That's cool.
Yeah, he worked at NASA during the Mercury years, and we talk about the fact that the Apollo 11 went to the moon on 64K of memory.
Right.
All right. And the computer that had only 64K. I'm not talking about 64 meg, 64K.
Yeah.
All right. That's like less than one old floppy disk.
Yeah, floppy disk was like 1.4 megabytes.
Meg, right. 64K. Think about how small amount of that memory that is. And that took up the whole width of the Saturn V rocket.
Wow.
To have that computer be that large.
That's crazy.
That. Yeah, it is. So transistors.
And it still worked.
Yeah, it did. And transistors, you know, changed everything in modern electronics. But tube amps are not modern electronics. They're really from a bygone era, and they are an anomaly where the vacuum tube still plays a vital role in the sound of what's coming out of that amp.